Hi, my name is Alex, and I want to tell you a story that changed my life. It won't just be a story about a breakup. It's about how I survived this tragedy, how I made a decision that at first seemed impossible, and how I learned to move on despite the pain. I never thought I would find myself in this situation, but here I am, with this story that may help you realize that even in the hardest moments, you can find the strength to change. Sophie and I were together for 8 years. It wasn't just marriage, but friendship, support, understanding. We went through a lot, good times and hard times, but it all felt like part of something big that was bound to lead us to a happy future. When I met Sophie, she was the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. We made plans, we dreamed, we created a cozy home. I was sure that love and mutual respect were the foundation on which to build a lasting relationship. But everything changed in an instant. It happened quietly, gradually, like a fog that imperceptibly envelops everything around. I didn't immediately realize what was happening, and when I did, it was too late. Hi, my name is Alex, and I want to tell you a story that changed my life. It won't just be a story about a breakup. It's about how I survived this tragedy, how I made a decision that at first seemed impossible, and how I learned to move on despite the pain. I never thought I would find myself in this situation, but here I am, with this story that may help you realize that even in the hardest moments, you can find the strength to change. Sophie and I were together for 8 years. It wasn't just marriage, but friendship, support, understanding. We went through a lot, good times and hard times, but it all felt like part of something big that was bound to lead us to a happy future. When I met Sophie, she was the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. We made plans, we dreamed, we created a cozy home. I was sure that love and mutual respect were the foundation on which to build a lasting relationship. That night we sat down to dinner as usual. Sophie looked strange. She didn't talk much, only answered my questions in one-word answers. I didn't immediately notice that something was wrong because I was used to her silence when she was tired. But today there was something different. It wasn't just tiredness. It was a kind of inner coldness. But everything changed in an instant. It happened quietly, gradually, like a fog that imperceptibly envelops everything around. I didn't immediately realize what was happening, and when I did, it was too late. Suddenly she uttered a phrase that made me freeze. "I don't want to be with you anymore." It wasn't a scream, not a scandal, but rather like a quiet sentence said in a calm but determined voice. I couldn't believe my ears. Sophie, my wife, whom I loved, whom I valued, had said those words. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to understand what was going on. I couldn't accept that she would just decide everything we had built together. She and I had always been able to talk about anything, solve problems together. Why was it like this now? She looked at me tiredly and quietly replied, "I don't feel anything for you anymore. We have become strangers to each other." These words struck me deeply, and I didn't know how to react. I expected her to say something about problems that could be solved, but instead she closed all doors for us. I remained silent. What could I say? All my words, all my attempts to change the situation. It was as if it was all unnecessary. I tried to talk her down. I suggested we try again. Maybe it was temporary, maybe it was a crisis we could work through. But she was adamant. There was no more care, no more passion, no more desire to be near her. "I don't want to be intimate with you anymore," she said. And that was it. I realized that her decision wasn't instantaneous. It was the result of all the things that had been building up in her soul over time. There were a lot of questions swirling around in my head. Where did we go wrong? When had things gone wrong? Why hadn't she told me this sooner? I felt lost, but despite that, I knew I had to accept her decision. If she decided to end our relationship, I couldn't force her to stay. I remained silent as I sat across from her. The words were gone from my head, and an emptiness was growing in my chest. Nothing seemed to have changed, but everything was different. It was the moment when I felt my life, familiar as it was, falling apart. I sat at the table, not knowing what to say. My heart was beating like a frenzy, and my thoughts were tangled like a spider's web. Everything around me felt detached, alien. I tried to understand what had happened. Sophie and I had been through different struggles, but could it have led to this? Had I been so blind that I hadn't noticed how distant she'd become? Why didn't I sense that something was wrong? I looked at her and noticed that her gaze had turned cold. It wasn't the warmth I remembered. It was a look in which I could no longer see myself. Sophie seemed to be in her own world, and I was somewhere else entirely. She sighed quietly and leaned back in her chair as if she was about to say something, But then she just remained silent. And in that moment, I realized that she had already made up her mind, that her choice was final. "You do realize it's for a reason, don't you?" she said suddenly. I nodded, but everything in my soul was screaming, "Why? Why did you decide that? Where did I go wrong?" But I couldn't ask that because I knew the answer wouldn't help me. It wasn't about what I did or didn't do. It was something deeper, something she must have been hiding for a long time, maybe without even realizing it. She continued, "I need time to think. I can't go on living my life pretending everything is okay anymore." I felt her words kind of cut me off from her. My mind tried to find answers, but something inside told me the answers wouldn't come. We'd been strangers to each other for a long time, we just hadn't realized it. I didn't know how to react. I'll admit I was hurt. I knew I couldn't make her love me again, couldn't bring back those moments when everything seemed so simple and carefree. All I could do was accept her decision. But how do I accept it? How do you let go of the person you planned your future with, the person you created your life with? "You love me, don't you?" I asked, not knowing what I expected her to say in response. But she didn't answer. She just lowered her head and whispered softly, "Sometimes love goes away, Alex. And I think that's what happened to us." It was like someone ripped something important out of my chest, and I felt a void forming inside me. My hand trembled as I placed it on the table, and I knew nothing would ever be the same again. I stood up to leave. Everything inside me was screaming that I had to do something, that this wasn't the end, that I could get her back. But at the same time, I realized that she had already made her decision. I looked at her again, and in her eyes I saw not only alienation, but also fatigue. Sophie was tired of us, of our relationship, of everything I thought was important, and I, as much as it hurt, had to let her go. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know what to do. But in that moment, standing at the door, I felt my life change. I couldn't hold on to her, but I also knew that if I kept fighting, if I kept forcibly holding her close, it would only lead to a bigger breakup. Sophie didn't try to stop me. She just sat with her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze fixed on the floor. I could feel the emptiness growing between us, like a chasm that couldn't be filled with words. This room had once been filled with laughter and conversation, but now it was cold and lifeless. I didn't know what to make of it, what to do with the fact that the person you lived with for almost a decade just decided to leave. And there was nothing I could do about it. I stood there not knowing what to say. All those words I had prepared for her seemed empty and meaningless now. I didn't know what she expected from me. I didn't know why she kept talking over and over again about the time it took, about how tired she was. All I could do was stand there looking at her, trying to figure out where we'd lost each other. But there were no answers. "You've already made your decision," I said, feeling the bitterness fill me. I didn't want to admit it, but it was true. She'd already made her choice, and maybe there was no point in arguing or trying to win her back. Maybe, in fact, all we had left were just memories of what used to be. She didn't answer. She just sat there, staring at one point, as if there was some process going on inside her that I had no idea about. Chaos resounded in my head as I tried to figure out how this could have happened. I wasn't a bad husband. Sophie and I had always supported each other, done our best for each other. I wasn't perfect, but I tried. I knew there were times in a relationship when you had to take a step back to realize what was going on. But I never thought it would end so quickly, so painfully. I knew that if I stayed here, I would only be making things harder. I took a deep breath, letting go of whatever I was holding in my chest. She was near, but she was so far away from me. "I'll leave you alone," I said, already about to turn around and walk away. I knew that if I stayed, I would only be ruining what was still left. I couldn't make her love me, and I didn't want to stay in a relationship that had only become a burden to both of us. I turned and took a step toward the door. Sophie didn't look up. I didn't know what she was feeling. Maybe she was relieved. Maybe she was in pain. But I knew now was not the time for words. I was ready to let her go, even though it was so hard. I was ready to stop fighting for something that no longer existed. As I walked outside, I felt how hard it was for me to breathe. The world around me seemed alien. I was alone. But I knew it was the right move. I couldn't hold her. And if she wanted to leave, I couldn't stop her. All I could do was try to find myself in this void, to learn to live with the loss and move forward. And maybe someday I'll realize what I need to do to feel alive again. After I left home, I felt an emptiness encompass me. It felt like the ground had gone from under my feet, and I was hanging in the air, not knowing where to go. Sophie. Still, I couldn't fully believe she was gone. That night was a boundary for me. I sat in the car, staring down the empty road, not knowing where I was going or what to do with myself next. There was only one word in my mind. Why? Why had she decided to leave? Why did she tear apart what we were building so easily? I couldn't put up with it. I couldn't understand why she did that. I was always there for her, always supportive, willing to do anything to make her feel loved and protected. But somewhere in her soul, there was something I couldn't see. For too long, we had lived under the illusion that everything was fine, that we were happy. I thought these were temporary difficulties, that we could overcome them. But I guess I was wrong. My thoughts kept going back to the moment when Sophie said she didn't want to be with me anymore. She tried to tell me that it wasn't because of me, that her feelings had changed. But why? What had happened that made her turn around and walk away? What killed me the most was the thought that maybe I wasn't the man for her that she once dreamed of being with. Or maybe I had become a burden to her. I didn't know, and it was eating me up inside. The problem was I didn't have any answers. She didn't say what happened. She just walked away. And no matter how hard I tried to figure it out, it just wouldn't let up. I decided not to come home. I needed time. Time to think, time to calm down. I couldn't just start looking for answers, agonizing in pain. I needed to sort myself out. I went to my parents' house. We hadn't seen each other in a while, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to get some alone time with myself and them. They didn't know what had happened. Mom always thought Sophie and I were doing well. I was afraid they would notice how I had changed, how my eyes were filled with longing and loss. But I needed to talk to someone who could understand me, who wouldn't judge me. When I arrived, my mom greeted me with a hug. She noticed something was wrong, but didn't ask. "You look tired," she said, and I couldn't hide my pain. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't. Being at my parents' house was getting harder by the hour. Questions came to mind again and again. Why did she leave? Where had I made a mistake? Late at night, I sat in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee. My mind was in complete chaos. I started going through all the moments with Sophie in my mind. Maybe I had been too busy with work. Maybe I had become less attentive to her needs. We'd spent so much time together, but was I doing everything right? Mom came into the kitchen and sat down next to me. She didn't ask any questions, just sat silently, as if waiting for me to speak. At some point, I couldn't hold it all in. "Mom, she's gone," I said, and I felt better. The words just came out as if a stone had fallen from my soul. Mom looked at me sadly but didn't say anything. She just reached out and put her hand on my shoulder. I felt her support, but her silence was even more frightening. "Why?" she asked softly. And in that moment, I realized that even if I tried to explain, no one could understand how I felt. I didn't know how to explain it myself. I just felt empty. Mom sighed and said, "You did the best you could, Alex. Sometimes, despite everything, people change. And maybe she's looking for something of her own too. It's not your fault." I wanted to object, wanted to say that it wasn't, that I could have made a difference, that I shouldn't have let her go, but I didn't. Mom was right. And if she was really looking for something else, I couldn't change that. I knew I needed to move on, but how could I do that if there was only emptiness inside me? I stayed at my parents' house for a few days, trying to calm down a little, but I didn't know what to do with myself. Every day I felt more and more lost. Sophie was gone, and I didn't know what to do with the memories that remained. A few days passed, and I still couldn't shake off that feeling of emptiness. I sat at my parents' house, but my thoughts were all about her, about what had happened, about what could have been, if only I had known the right thing to do. My friends tried to distract me, but all efforts were futile. Sophie was gone, and I didn't know how to move on. I realized that I needed to accept the situation, that I needed to move forward. But how? Sophie wasn't just my wife, she was my best friend, my partner, and now she's gone. It felt strange, like I was on a precipice, and all I could do was step forward, even if I didn't know what would follow. I felt the pressure of it all. I couldn't breathe in this house. Every single thing reminded me of her, and every single thing reminded me of how I had lost everything. I got up off the floor, putting her things back in the closet, and then the thought popped into my head that maybe I should stop hoarding everything. I should let go. But how do I let go of something that was so important to me? How do I cut off something that was part of me? That day, I decided to go to her. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I needed to understand what was going on. Sophie was at her parents' house. Her mom, I think, was trying to help her sort herself out. I knew she wouldn't wait for me, but I had to talk to her. I arrived at her parents' house, but when I got to the door, I felt something in my chest tighten. I can't explain it, but in that moment I realized this wasn't over. I opened the door and immediately saw Sophie. She was standing there with her eyes downcast. "What are you doing here?" she asked, and her voice was as cold as I expected it to be. But I couldn't just leave. "I need to talk to you, Sophie. I can't just leave everything behind like that," I said, feeling my heart fill with pain again. She raised her eyes and looked at me. It was hard, but I kept going. "I don't know what happened, and I don't understand how you feel, but it's important for me to let you know that I will never stop loving you, even if you don't want to be with me anymore. I can't just take everything that happened between us and forget it." She was silent, and I could feel the heavy moments dragging between us, but at some point her gaze softened. "I don't know what's going on either, Alex. I can't explain it. I just can't be with you right now," she said quietly. I didn't know what to say. Everything was in those words, her doubts, her struggles, her fears. But I couldn't leave her, couldn't accept it. "You think I can't understand? You think I don't feel pain?" I said, trying not to snap, but unable to stand it. "But you won't even try." Sophie was torn between leaving me or moving on. She wasn't ready to make a decision, and at some point I realized I needed to give her her freedom. But freedom cost too much. "You know I love you, but I can't go on," she said, and in her eyes I could see how hard this decision was for her. As I stood in front of her, I suddenly realized that if I let her go, I would lose not only her but myself. I couldn't do that, but she did, and it was over. I went home, and at home, I was alone. In the evening, I took her things and put them in a box. This time I didn't stop. I didn't think about what it meant. I just put everything in the box and left it by the door. I didn't know what was going to happen next. But in that moment, I knew I had let go. But how much pain it cost me. A few weeks went by, and I could feel the emptiness encompassing me. After I decided to leave her things at the door and close this episode of my life, I still couldn't free myself from the feeling that I had lost something. Thoughts of Sophie wouldn't let go of me, and every day alone seemed harder and harder. Even when I was with friends, I couldn't rid myself of this empty pain that haunted me. I tried to work, to meet people, but everything inside me was closed. One night I sat in my office and looked out the window, at the city lights. Everyone seemed so alive, so full, and I was just an empty place in the midst of the world. I felt life slipping away from me. It seemed that everything I knew was in the past, and the future was losing its meaning. I suddenly realized that my actions were an escape from my own feelings. I was trying to let go, trying to get rid of the pain, but in reality I was still stuck in that past, attached to her, attached to the memories. One day when I was coming home, I saw a box on my doorstep. It was covered in dust and rain. It was strange because I had already left her things at the door, and this box was familiar. At first I didn't realize what it was, but once I opened it, it became clear. It was a box of her personal belongings that I couldn't leave behind, and obviously she couldn't get rid of that load either. I felt mixed emotions, regret, anger, and something else I couldn't describe. I sat down on the floor and started looking through her things. Among them were pictures, her favorite book, things we had bought together, and even little mementos we had brought each other throughout our lives. All of these items were things we had experienced together, and now they were just empty symbols. I felt this moment as a goodbye, and a moment of acceptance at the same time. We were both trapped in our own past, but we needed to move on. I didn't know what was next for us. I didn't know if she would come back, but I knew I had to let go. It's impossible to live in the past, impossible to live in a place that no longer exists. I put the box back, but with a different purpose. I decided it was time to stop holding on to illusions. It was time to start building a new life. I didn't know how to do it, but I knew it was necessary. I couldn't keep expecting things to go back to the way they were. Maybe everything I had with Sophie was what it was, and nothing could change it. I couldn't take back that moment when she said she didn't want to be with me. But I could choose how I was going to move on with my life. Along with that, I realized that I needed to change not only my life, but also my views of myself. I had always believed that if I lost Sophie, I would lose myself. But that was a mistake. I could learn to love myself again, to love life, to be open to new possibilities. I didn't know where to look for answers or what to do next, but I needed to stop being a victim of my own experiences. It was hard, but I finally realized that I needed to forgive, both myself and Sophie. Forgive for the pain, for the betrayal, for all the mistakes. And maybe find a way to get back to myself. Maybe someday we could meet again. But even if not, I knew that life didn't end here. As the months passed, I changed. I started to rebuild my life. I met new people, started believing in possibilities again. I still haven't gotten over Sophie, but I've learned to value myself and move forward. And despite all the pain, I realized that every step was a step towards a new life, and it was the only way to overcome what had happened. Life went on, and I was ready to accept it for what it was. A few more months passed, and I was already feeling like a slightly different person. My life had changed, and although the painful memories of what had happened still remained, I had learned to live with them. I still didn't know what Sophie thought about it all. I didn't know what she was going through, or if she had any regrets. But I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I didn't want to feel attached to that old life anymore. I just kept moving forward. One day I met a woman named Jessica. She was nothing like Sophie, and there was something comforting about that. Jessica was open, friendly, sincere. I knew right away that she wouldn't do what Sophie had done. With each day I spent with her, I began to feel more alive. I felt like I had a chance at happiness. But despite all this, I couldn't get rid of the memories of Sophie. One night, as I sat at home thinking, I suddenly received a text message. It was from Sophie. My heart raced faster than I expected, and I immediately realized that I couldn't just ignore her. We hadn't been in touch for a long time, and now she had decided to get in touch. I opened the message and read a few words that stirred all my feelings. I need to talk. I really regret what happened. Please give me a chance to explain myself. I didn't know what to do. On one hand, I didn't want to relive all the pain again, but on the other hand, I couldn't help but respond. I decided that seeing her was a chance for both of us. We couldn't go back in time, but could we at least understand what had happened? Maybe it was important for me to finally be free of all those unspoken words and misunderstandings. We met at the cafe. I arrived a little early and sat there wondering what would happen when she arrived. Soon I saw her. She looked different from before. There was something new in her eyes, something I hadn't seen in her before. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was just the time that had passed that had changed us both. When she sat down across from me, the silence between us was almost palpable. She didn't know where to begin, and I didn't know what to say. But eventually she spoke. I don't know what happened. I was blind. I was unfair. I didn't appreciate you, and I only realize it all now. It's no excuse, but it took me a while to see what I'd lost. I listened intently, but I couldn't help but feel my senses becoming tangled again. I was already far away from her, and despite her words, I didn't know how to react. I couldn't go back to the way things were because it was something that hurt, and I had already been through it. But I also realized that forgiveness wasn't for her. It was for me, so that I could move on. Not for her sake, for myself. You can be sorry all you want, Sophie, but I can't go back in time. I can't forget what you did, but I'm willing to forgive, because I don't want to carry that pain around anymore, I said, feeling the inner tension slowly easing. She was silent for a moment and then finally nodded. I understand. I'm not asking to take it all back. I just want you to know how much I regret it. I stood up and headed for the exit, leaving her sitting at the table. It was a moment of forgiveness, not because I was ready to go back to her, but because I was ready to move forward without looking back. I was able to let it go. I knew it was time to move on. From that moment on, my life made sense again. I continued to grow my relationship with Jessica, and although it wasn't easy, I felt like I was moving in the right direction. I was no longer the same person I had been when I loved Sophie. I had become someone new, and it was liberating. Maybe I would meet Sophie again someday, but I already knew that my path would go in a different direction, and I was ready for it.